Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tea Time. We are New Jersey Tea Party Coalition, and you can find it at njteapartycoalition.org. Tonight, we have a great speaker who I happened to run into when I was in Washington, D.C. He was speaking at the anti-Iran rally, and he was following notables such as Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and, of course, Mark Levin. So we welcome you tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Mauro, who has been thoroughly enmeshed in the situation. He will update us on what is happening, and he will keep us informed. And we invite you to go to our website when you have an opportunity, check out the video, and share it with your friends. So welcome, everyone. Ryan Mauro.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. My name is Ryan Mauro, and I'm the National Security Analyst for the Clarion Project. Our website is clarionproject.org. We're passing around the newsletter sign-up sheet so you can get our emails once or twice a week so you can get my analysis. That way, we have each of our DVDs in the back, Obsession, The Third Jihad, Iranium, and our most recent one, Honor Diaries, and I'll talk about them a bit later. But today, I want to talk about the Iran deal and really its result. And if I had to summarize its result, what it comes down to is this: Iran on steroids. And the position that my opposition to the deal comes from is contrary to how it's been characterized by the supporters of the deal and by the Iranian regime itself. They make it sound as if we want a war, as if we oppose peace. Actually, what I would argue is that opposing this deal is the most anti-war position, pro-peace position that actually has credibility that you can have. So simply put, if I was a nuke-seeking, terror-sponsoring mullah in Tehran, and I was asked to come up with the best way to expand the regime's power and to develop a nuclear weapon, and the best way to get there, not the fastest, but the most efficient way, I would say sign a deal like this. There's one way you can go after a nuclear weapon, which is where you assemble one as quickly as possible, like North Korea did, and then you work on the next. Or there's a smarter way to do it. You can do it the way that the Iranians are doing it. So that one day you flick on the lights, and then you start manufacturing an arsenal. And you're in a position of strength when that happens. And the international community has very little time to react. So President Obama recently accused opponents of the deal of siding with the Iranian hardliners within the regime, who also opposed the deal and shout death to America. But what he left out is, and he knows this, is that the Iranian regime's supporters of the deal also shout death to America. That was straight up deceptive. And I encourage everyone, when you go home, I'm a big fan of smoking gun evidence, having 1, 2, or 3 pieces of evidence that you can memorize or write down somewhere, and you can show it to someone and make your case very quickly. And here's a good example of that. You can look up a quote by former President Rafsanjani of Iran. He's known as one of these moderates who supports the deal. And here's what he said in 2001. This is an exact quote. "If one day the Islamic world is also equipped with weapons like those that Israel possesses now, nukes, then the imperialist strategy will reach a standstill, because the use of even one nuclear bomb inside Israel will destroy everything. However, it will only harm the Islamic world." Now, some of you may have heard this quote before, probably very few, but some of you may have, but it often ends right there. But the next sentence is just as important to include. "It is not irrational to contemplate such an eventuality." You see, so if you're talking to someone who is cynical, who supports a deal, they'd say, well, he's talking theoretically. It's true. If the Islamic world used a nuke, it would destroy Israel, and then Israel would retaliate, and the Islamic world would still remain, albeit with a lot of damage. But what the former Iranian president, the moderate, says is that this is a realistic scenario. He talks about it as if it's a positive thing, an option that could be exercised in the future. And he supports the nuclear deal. Now, there's 2 debates going on right now about the deal today. One is whether the deal should be supported or not. And the second debate is among those who oppose it. And of those who oppose it, there's one side that says scrap it as soon as possible. And the other side says we will police it. If the Iranians violate it, we'll be real tough and we'll kick them out and we'll end the deal then. And the reason that doesn't work is because it misses a very important point. Iranian compliance with the deal is just as much of a threat as Iranian non-compliance. In fact, if I was the regime, I would comply with this deal for a very long time because it doesn't require me to scrap my nuclear equipment. I have to get rid of some uranium. I can get more later. I have to unplug some centrifuges. I can plug them back in later. Nothing is permanently disarmed. And so if you're content with the deal, if Iran complies with it, then you're allowing Iran to lure you like a rat into a mousetrap. Now, this deal, even if Iran complies, like I said, it preserves the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, but it also minimizes our ability to stop them in the future if and when the decision is made to actually assemble a nuclear arsenal as opposed to have the ability to quickly produce one, which is a really minor difference. And most importantly of all, it potentially saves and revitalizes the Islamic revolution of the Iranian regime. Because the fundamental problem here isn't the nuclear weapon per se, it's the regime in possession of it and the ideology that they export. So if you have a deal that even if it did stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, if you dramatically expand that ideology that drives them, then what good did you really do? What did you really accomplish? One argument for the deal that we often hear is that the U.S. can always exercise the military option later, and the snapback sanctions will kick in later if we need to. So why not try it? Give it a shot. Maybe the Iranians will go along with it. And if they don't go along with it, well, then we can crack down on them. So give it a shot. On the contrary, this deal does not disarm Iran, but it does disarm someone. Us. Iran's enemies. And here's how. At this very moment, Russia is preparing to send 4 advanced air defense systems called the S-300 by the end of this year to Iran. These systems have been described by experts as game changers, particularly for the Israelis, because their air capabilities are not up to par with ours. And even for the American Air Force, it would raise casualties and raise the risk. In addition, Russia is preparing to sell them advanced combat jets. This is all allowed under the deal. What Russia said is that because of the initial interim deal before the latest final one, that the ban on selling these weapons to Iran is now void, and so they can begin arming them up. And these systems will be used to protect the Iranian nuclear sites. And these systems are not prevented by the deal. I've always said, if there's an air defense system for the nuclear sites, it should be covered by a nuclear deal. It should be viewed as one entity. Now, is it possible that the U.S. and Israel can overcome these systems? Sure. But what Iran understands is not about whether we can overcome them. It's a political decision. It's about cost benefit. It's one thing for a political leader to launch an airstrike that's not going to have much repercussions. It's going to be highly successful. It's a whole nother thing if you're taking on an air defense system that's going to result in pilots possibly being killed or captured by your enemy. The risk becomes higher. And so the sites can still be attacked, but if the cost is too high, then Iran knows that the political leadership will not authorize it. So that's the objective of getting these systems that will be in arrival by the end of this year. And then whenever it goes operational, it really puts us in a tough position. Because now, especially the Israelis, think about the choice that this presents us with. We can strike before the systems go live. But then whoever does the strike, if it's the Israelis, gets blamed for the deal collapsing, not Iran. And if they strike before the systems go live, then Iran can say, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we can withdraw and start developing nuclear weapons. We actually didn't want nukes, but now that you bombed us, we're going to build them. And you better believe the world will blame Israel in that case for Iran developing a nuclear weapon. So very, very smart strategy on the part of the Iranians. But then if you wait and you want to execute the military option, if it even remains on the table, the costs are dramatically higher. In addition, within 5 years or less, the UN arms embargo will be lifted. Iran will be permitted to begin modernizing its military, buying combat aircraft, large artillery systems, attack helicopters, warships, missiles, and related training and equipment and other weapons that would go on to the missiles and the warships. So again, that disarms the West of its military options in the future. One of the most effective ways of undermining the Iranian nuclear program has been covert operations. Did you notice that Iranian scientists aren't ending up dead in the streets anymore? those very convenient explosions that just so happen to occur at nuclear facilities, with the exception of one that just happened, but they stopped when the interim deal was struck. Someone decided to make those accidents stop happening. And now, under this deal, and this is actually in the deal what I'm about to tell you, the U.S. is required to provide Iran with training to prevent sabotage of its nuclear facilities. So whoever's trying to sabotage them, let's assume it's the Israelis, as they're trying to sabotage the Iranian nuclear facilities, they're going to be going up against defenses that we provided. You better believe that after that cyber attack, Stuxnet, that did a lot of damage to the Iranian centrifuges, that the Iranians said, we want to know how you did that and how to stop it. Otherwise, that wouldn't be in there. That's what they're thinking of. So the covert option is also undermined. Another tool, and this is a constitutional issue, is how state and local governments have divested from Iran. There's different forms of legislation that have been passed on the state and local levels in order to prevent money from going into companies that do business with the Iranian regime. It's been very effective. 30 states have done it, including California. It's something that has been an easy win. If you read the deal, it requires the president to use, quote, all available authorities to force state and local authorities to lift sanctions on Iran, to reverse the divestment. So the federal government is required by the Iran deal to come in and tell the state and local governments, you need to comply with this deal, even though it's technically not a treaty according to that standard, but you still have to comply with it so that Iran can get a lot of money and your representatives, your constituents, basically what they say doesn't matter, because we, the federal government, say, no, that money's going to the Iranians and the businesses that work with them. So the effect of this is that with governments around the world and powerful companies getting rich off of business with Iran, the economic option through sanctions is also disarmed. Because what's going to happen is that in the future, if we want to sanction Iran, you have to get the international community to go along with it. The U.S. can hurt them alone, but you need Europe, you need China, you need all these other countries to go along with it, and there has been success in doing that. But once those sanctions are lifted, it becomes a race to cash in. In fact, delegations from around the world are already flying into Iran, drafting the contracts so that the second they can legally do it, they sign the contract and they move forward with the business, because they're all competing with each other now. So if you believe that snapback sanctions can happen in the future, if Iran violates the deal or does something aggressive that we can get the world again to sanction them again, this is what you have to believe. You have to believe that countries around the world will be willing to hurt themselves a lot financially in order to hurt Iran a little at our request. That's not going to happen. And even if they did, let's bend over backwards and say, even if snapback sanctions worked, the vulnerable sectors of Iran's economy that those sanctions have targeted are going to be strengthened, so they won't have as much of an effect. If those weaknesses are taken care of, then you slap them with sanctions and they're self-sufficient. What good does it do? And remember, from the Iranian perspective, they just have to put up with the sanctions long enough until the international community's will evaporates. So if you make the argument, well, eventually it'll hurt them, what the Iranians are saying to themselves is we just have to be able to withstand sanctions in the future for about a year. It'll take them about a year to develop a nuclear weapon, best case scenario. So they just have to be able to survive that short period of time. And here's how we know it. In 2005, the current moderate president of Iran, Rouhani, was the chief nuclear negotiator for Iran under Ahmadinejad. And he repeatedly bragged on videotape about how he used negotiations to divide the West, split the U.S. and Europe, in order to advance the nuclear program. That's what he bragged about when he was campaigning for the presidency. What do you think he's doing now? And in one speech, again, publicly available, he denied that Iran was seeking nuclear weapons. Of course, it's a public speech. But then he said this, but we need to learn from Pakistan. And this is the comment he made. He noticed that the international community had placed severe pressure on Pakistan not to build nuclear weapons. But what happened once Pakistan did build nuclear weapons? The world shrugged its shoulders, said, well, that didn't work, it's game over, and it's time to move on. And so he was saying once Iran develops the nuclear program to a sufficient capacity, that the world's pressure will alleviate because they'll realize that the game is over. So that's what the regime expects to happen now. They're putting themselves in a better position, militarily, economically, in all sorts of ways, so that one day when they want to develop a nuclear arsenal, not a bomb, but an arsenal very quickly, they just have to withstand sanctions maybe for a year, and at that point, it'll go back to business as usual. And they have every reason to believe that, if we're being honest with ourselves. Like I said before, the threat we face from Iran isn't just about nuclear weapons, though. It's about the ideology which is enshrined in their constitution, which means that they violate their constitution the second that they stop doing what I'm about to quote. They say that they are required to pursue the, quote, downfall of all non-Islamic governments. So this devotion to jihad, supporting terrorism and attacking the United States and our allies, that's in the Constitution. You're not going to get them to stop because the second they stop, you can impeach the leadership for it. They're legally required to sponsor terrorism. So Iranians and others in the region, though, and this is where there's some area of hope, they did not see the regime's Islamic revolution as a successful system and ideology. For all the talk that implementing Sharia governance was something that would bring wealth and power above what the West can offer the world, Iranians look around and what do they say? Oppression, bankruptcy, isolation, a country that could be powerful but is a far cry from what it could be. So Iranian propaganda about how wonderful their system is falls flat because it's so divorced from reality. And to me, this is, above everything else, one of maybe the biggest danger of the deal because of how that changes. Before the interim deal was signed, the Iranian economy collapsed by 40% over the summer of 2012 due to the sanctions that, to their credit, was implemented by the Obama administration. And they were relatively minor sanctions. 40% decline in their economy. They were panicking. The normal guys that normally pound their chests and start talking about how tough they are and they can withstand anything, you could hear the fear in their voices. They were in trouble. The budget for Hezbollah was cut by some estimates as much as 40% 2 years before the sanctions were even implemented. The price of oil fell to $80 per barrel when the regime's budget required it to be at $140 per barrel. After the interim deal was signed, the first phase, the economy rebounded by 30% almost immediately. And now, Iran is expecting $100 to $150 billion in unfrozen assets to be returned to them. To put that in perspective, that'd be like the U.S. economy suddenly receiving a check for $4.3 trillion. Can you imagine what that would do for our country? That's what the Iranians are waiting to get. That's a lot of money, especially if you consider the fact that the Iranian defense budget, all of it, is only $30 billion, the entire defense budget. The monthly salary of a Taliban terrorist who is paid by the Iranians. Yes, Iran hires the Taliban terrorists, even though they hate each other, to kill our soldiers in Afghanistan. The monthly salary is $580 per month. Terrorism is cheap. And here's where it gets worse. Iran is expecting $200 to $300 billion in foreign investment as sanctions are lifted, which is direct income, but then it also generates additional income. So that's why I say what we're looking forward to is Iran on steroids. Now, there's an argument that engagement with the world will empower the Iranian people. You'll get Western influence in there, and it'll undermine the regime. You empower the Iranian people, the regime is weakened, and therefore it falls, and the regime becomes moderate or maybe gets overthrown. But as Democratic Senator Menendez said, the regime is not stupid enough to sign a deal that would undermine its own existence and its own ideology. It simply doesn't make sense. And here's another key flaw. 80% of the Iranian economy is public. It's state-owned. And 1/3 is owned by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. Those are the thugs that keep the regime in power, shoot women in the streets, and sponsor terrorists. 1/3 of the economy is owned by them. So who are you going to be doing business with? You're not doing business with the poor, innocent Iranian shopkeeper down the street. You're doing it directly with the regime. That's where the money's going. Supreme Leader Khamenei has a net worth of about $95 billion. So again, the trade will not be with the Iranian people, it will be with the regime. The ones whose wallets will be getting fatter are the security services that oppress the Iranian people, not one of those teachers that recently went on strike in Iran and you probably didn't hear about because for some reason the media is not covering the fact that Iranians still are protesting. Yes, you don't have the dramatic pictures of millions of people in the streets because it's hard to organize that type of thing when they wiretap all of your communications and they shoot you in the streets. But it's still going on sporadically. The booming economy, the success of Iran's terrorist proxies, and the stability of the regime will enable the Ayatollahs to do something that they haven't ever been able to do before. Present the Iranian Islamic Revolution as an actual viable ideology, a source of strength and prosperity that only needed time and backbone for success. Whereas before, you could only argue that it failed and blame the West. Now for the first time, they'll be able to say, look at our wealth, look at our power. It comes from radical Islam. It comes from how we do things. Your propaganda is a lot more effective when you can actually point to results. And so an ideology that should have been vanquished by us will be passed on to terrorize the next generation. This is a regime that we never had to tolerate. It could have been gotten rid of. The ideology should be dead. But under this deal, and if the Iranians comply with it, their ideology becomes rich, and so does the regime, and they live on. And speaking of terrorism, one of the criticisms we often hear of the deal is that it will cause a nuclear arms race, and that's true. But there's also a conventional arms race that's very dangerous. Each neighbor of Iran is already buying conventional weapons, and there's also a proxy jihadist arms race. The neighbors of Iran understand that once impoverished terrorist groups like Hezbollah that was struggling financially are now going to be empowered. So what would the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, what are they going to do? They're going to beef up their own terrorist proxies in order to compete with them. And so you have a terrorist arms race happening as well. Yemen is just a taste of what it is to come. That's Iran when it's poor, is what you're seeing right now. And as this happens, and you're already seeing this, you're going to see more and more voices that are calling on the United States to basically ally with Iran against the Sunni jihadists like ISIS and like Al-Qaeda because they're worse, because they're crazy, because they behead people and put it on social media. But let's be clear. The Iranian regime and the Syrian regime have a symbiotic relationship with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They are not your friends. Iran was found guilty, and this is another smoking gun piece of evidence that you should all write down and remember. Iran was found guilty by a federal judge in 2011 of being materially responsible for 9/11. How can you defeat that argument? If Iran is to blame for 9/11 back in 2001, then how can you say that this is a regime that we should work with? To this day, according to the Obama administration, Iran allows Al-Qaeda to operate a pipeline through Iranian territory through which they shift their personnel and their money. And again, like I said, Iran sponsors the Taliban. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda's influence grows wherever Iran's influence grows. Because both are trying to trigger a region-wide sectarian war that the vast majority of the people there don't want anything to do with. I talk to a lot of people over there, and they tell me how Shiites and Sunnis, particularly in Iraq, they get married. They hang out. It doesn't even come up. They don't all hate and want to kill each other. But sectarian warfare happens when you're arming proxies that want to make that happen. And this sectarian warfare can spill over into the United States because it already has. Such as when Iran, and most people don't know this, tried to shut down Saudi oil production with a massive cyber attack. Imagine what that would have done to the world economy. Or when Iran tried to kill the Saudi ambassador in D.C., not by poisoning his coffee or shooting him in the head, but by blowing up the restaurant that he was going to have lunch at, bringing down with him dozens of Americans. And they were going to use the Mexican drug cartels as a cover. Iran's proxies in Iraq, who we are essentially providing air cover for now, have a nickname among the local Iraqis: Shiite ISIS. Because they're every bit as brutal. The only difference is that they don't put it on social media, so no one sees it and gets outraged about it. And so they just see, oh, these are Iranians that are fighting the ISIS, and, well, they're not beheading people. Yes, they are. then they make the situation worse. As the radical Shiite elements grow, so do the radical Sunni jihadists in response. So you have to go after both of them. What's also got to be understood is that Iran, Assad, and Hezbollah use ISIS and Al-Qaeda to make themselves sound moderate. And it's a strategy that works. And I've got to tell you, even at churches that I've spoken to, and a lot of people that are hawkish say, you know what, Assad, he's a bad guy, but he's better than those other guys. And he protects the Christian minority, so he's my guy now. You've got to understand that we are falling right into the strategy, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But I want to bring up another point since I mentioned the church. There is a major interfaith offensive that's going on that is spearheaded by foes of Israel and Islamists. And here's a great example. Last year, a delegation of 30 Christian leaders, led by evangelical pastor Joel C. Hunter, a megachurch leader and spiritual advisor to President Obama, went to Iran and met with regime-approved mullahs. The result? One pastor, Pastor Bob Roberts, returned home and wrote, "Guess what? The regime isn't as bad as we think." How do you know? I talked to the mullahs. So I'm an expert now. He described the regime as, quote, open-minded. But he's a mega-church pastor. It's funny when you hear it, but think about the impact this guy has. And he actually has some small level of credibility because to an audience that doesn't study this, he can say, oh, well, I met with them, I talked with them, so I know them. And here's some actual quotes from what he wrote. "You thought they were a bunch of uneducated religious zealots? Think again. They hate terrorism, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and they do not like being classified with religious extremists like that." Another quote. "Iran has never showed aggression in trying to take over the nations surrounding her. That in itself should be paused to evaluate." When Pastor Hunter was asked whether he confronted the regime over its oppression of Christians, which the UN says is now at unprecedented heights, he replied, "We didn't go over there to confront people on certain issues." So why the hell did you go over there? Did you go over there just so that you could go and talk to the mullahs and come back and brag about how knowledgeable you are and how open-minded you are because you meet with the worst of the worst and you're able to develop a friendship? I don't get it. I also want to talk a bit about the end times element of the ideology because that gets a lot of attention from ISIS. Iran is talking about the same exact thing. An Iranian-backed militia in Iraq was named the Khorassani Brigades, and its emblem is identical to that of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. So it's blatantly an extension of Iran, but instead of calling themselves the Khamenei Brigades, the name of the supreme leader, they call themselves the Khorassani Brigades. Isn't that a little odd? Well, the reason is because there's a figure in Islamic end times prophecy for the Shiites that says that the Shiites will be led by a guy named Khorassani, and during the final war against the infidel, during which the Mahdi, this Messiah-type figure, will appear and grant great final victory. The regime often insinuates that Khamenei, the supreme leader, is an incarnation of Khorassani, this end times figure. And I've got to be honest with you. If you look at the details of the prophecies and you imagine yourself being there and giving credibility to those prophecies, they kind of make sense. The final conflict involves civil war in Iraq and Syria against enemies who fly black flags, take over towns in Iraq, and follow a leader who names himself after cities. Does anyone know what the name of the ISIS caliph is? Al-Baghdadi. And he flies black flags and slaughters Shiites. So to them, prophecy is being fulfilled all around. Here's another one. The big green light for when all of these end times things start happening would be the death of Saudi King Abdullah, who just died. And after that, and I wrote about this at the time, you can look it up. I said this is the next step because I was just following the prophecies. There would be a holy Shiite revolution in Yemen that would succeed. They already had a base there. It made no sense for them to topple the government and get into that big fight. Why'd they do it? It's the next step in the prophecy. And then after that, there would be civil strife in Saudi Arabia. So that's going to be the next thing they work on. Even the hostility between the U.S. and Israel is seen as the fulfillment of prophecy. A regime newspaper in 2012 said, with diminishing support for Israel and with the upcoming collapse of the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, there won't be any obstacles left facing Iran with its policy of annihilation of Israel. The reason it coupled those things together is because that's the order of the prophecies. So they see the U.S.-Israeli relationship declining as meaning that Israel will get weaker and therefore the prophecy can be fulfilled. So like I said, the next stage in their prophecy involves instability in Saudi Arabia and creating an Arab coalition led by Iran to wage war on Israel and its allies. So according to their own prophecies, they ally with Sunni jihadists in order to take on Israel and take on us. And this is very easy for Iran to do. These prophecies that they're talking about fulfilling are achievable, especially after this deal goes through. A representative of Khamenei said that Bahrain is, quote, the best opportunity to begin setting the stage for the emergence of the 12th Imam. Bahrain is a monarchy led by Sunnis that is allied with the U.S., but the population is majority Shiite. So if you're living in Tehran, it makes sense that this is about to happen. In Saudi Arabia, everyone always thinks about the oil in Saudi Arabia, and they think that that means that they're strong. 90% of Saudi Arabia's oil is located in the eastern province, where all the Shiites live. Think about that from the Iranian perspective. A heck of a coincidence, right? Your enemy, Saudi Arabia, all of the Shiites are located right where the oil is, so you can just go in and take it. And like I said before, all of this is related to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. You can't talk about the Iran deal without talking about those threats as well. And we must not fall for that illusion that Assad is the solution, that we can replace Sunni radicals with Shiite radicals and murderers. In Syria, a nation of only 23 million people, over 250,000 people have been killed over just 4.5 years. Over 1 million have been injured. About 11 million have had to become refugees, including 4 million that have had to leave Syria and go abroad to places like Europe and the United States. That's where the refugee crisis is happening. Anyone with a heart has to ask themselves what we can do to stop that. Not everyone in Syria is a terrorist. Not everyone is evil there. We're talking about kids and families. I've had contact with Syrian opposition activists who are great people that would love to see the U.S. succeed. And everyone has a story about a family member being imprisoned and tortured, someone losing a leg, losing a family member. It's really hell on earth. But the problem is that on the surface, at least, it looks like there's no one to root for. On the side of the Syrian dictatorship, which, by the way, is responsible for killing American soldiers and supporting terrorism since the 1980s, so they're not your friend, is Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. That's who's keeping them in power. Yet, on the other hand, you have Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, the Islamic State, ISIS, and a mixture of dozens of rebel groups. And among them, there are some genuine secular democratic moderates, but they're mixed in. And even though they exist, the majority of those who actually have guns are still Islamist extremists because the good guys don't have an infrastructure and international support to compete with them. So when you're getting weapons from Turkey and Saudi Arabia, it's easy for the bad guys to be the ones that control and dominate the rebel forces. And that side gets support from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Kuwait, to some degree the United States, and Egypt is somewhere in between. So to most Americans, it sounds like this is horrible, but we can do nothing. Let our enemies kill each other and then fight the remnants, as Donald Trump recommended. But that's what we've been doing. How's it worked out for us? The status quo is breeding a new generation of terrorists. A recent congressional terrorism report said that we are, quote, witnessing the largest global convergence of jihadists in history. To put that in perspective, we all know the result of the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan. It's 5 times greater than that. And that jihad was 10 years long. This one's only 4.5. The number of ISIS-inspired terror plots against the West has doubled over the course of the last year. And if you look at the numbers, they are recruiting just as fast as we are killing them. So there's an increasing number of voices saying, why not help Russia, Assad, and Iran kill Al-Qaeda and ISIS, wipe them out, and then we'll take on the winners? First, it's not going to work. There's a manpower shortage on the part of the dictatorship, so the fight goes on indefinitely. But secondly, wherever Iranian influence grows, again, the response is Sunni jihad. So they feed off of each other. And thirdly, we have to recognize how Iran and Assad designed the situation you're seeing today for years and years. As far back as 2009, I wrote an article based on my research of the Syrian opposition and what was going on in Syria about their strategy, which I call the arsonist firefighter strategy. They light a fire and then they show up and say that they're the ones that we need to put it out. What Iran, Syria, and now Russia want is the world to have to choose between Assad and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Assad allowed ISIS to grow within Syria. He concentrated his fire on the more moderate elements or the less extreme because he knew that if there's a viable, acceptable alternative to him, he's a goner. All the Syrian people will ditch him. The international community will embrace his enemy. But if your enemy is ISIS and Al-Qaeda, oh, you don't look so bad anymore. So he let them grow. That's why only 5% of Russia's airstrikes have actually been on ISIS. It's been on the other groups because they want to strengthen his dictator and make that the choice. And as frightening as all that is, though, there is some good news. The Iranian regime is weak, and it is possible to develop a strategy that appeals to both sides of the political aisle, including those who support the deal. The former co-chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2008, who opposes the deal, said, quote, "We risk compromising our progressive values if we eliminate sanctions and prop up this reactionary regime. The message of freedom from the Iranian theocracy appeals to almost anyone, whether you're a progressive human rights activist or you're a national security conservative. The administration, and this is key for strategy coming forward, says that the deal is unrelated to human rights and terrorism, and sanctions on that basis will remain. So the deal prevents sanctions for nuclear activity, but it doesn't prevent sanctions for terrorism and human rights abuses. Supporters and opponents of the deal, rather than arguing endlessly when the deal's already here. And so we have to deal with that situation. What we can do is forge a consensus that says if we can't sanction them for nuclear activity because of the deal, all right, well, then let's sanction them for terrorism and human rights. If you were to blacklist the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, as Hillary Clinton has supported in the past, then you'd be sanctioning the same entity that is linked to their nuclear program. So come together on that. Support the Iranian people's struggle for freedom. That doesn't violate the deal, and that should be a bipartisan cause. And again, and the reason I'm pointing these areas of agreement out isn't to endorse a candidate. It's to say that there are ways that we can get along and actually move forward. Hillary Clinton said in an interview last year that the thing she's thinking about is how to develop a strategy to defeat jihadism. She used that word, jihadism, just like we defeated communism because it's an ideological strategy. She recently came out with a 5-point plan to deal with the consequences of the Iran deal, even though she supports it. And the recommendations are ones that we can actually embrace. So again, I know I'm speaking to a Tea Party group. I'm not here trying to make you vote for Hillary Clinton. What I'm saying is that in the midst of heated disagreement, pay attention to the details where you can work together so that we can move forward against our common adversaries, in this case, the Iranian regime. I recently spent some time talking to a former Iranian political prisoner who was tortured in a jail for years. And he was telling me how Iranian activists wear red, white, and blue as a way to silently signal that they're on the same side. Because you can't ban colors. If you're out protesting and saying, I love America and down with the regime, they can come arrest you. But what are they going to do? Ban red, white, and blue? He went so far as to say that they even have American flags hidden in their homes at times. During the Green Revolution of 2009, when the regime tried to get the crowd to chant death to America, the Iranian people chanted back death to Russia and death to China. That was widely reported. And on the topic of the level of faith within Iran, there's many Muslims there that interpret their faith in a way that collides with what the Iranian regime preaches, and those people can be our allies. But there are also a lot of atheists and evangelical Christians that are increasing in number within Iran and the Muslim world as a whole. In 2010, a top Iranian official actually had to issue instructions to the clergy to avoid political matters and to focus on getting people back to the mosques because, in his words, attendance had thinned out. So if we are to have diplomacy with Iran and open an embassy in Tehran, my argument to those that advocate that is say, well, at least make your top priority meeting with and allying with the Iranian freedom fighters. If every time you meet with a regime official, head over and have a meeting with an Iranian activist. Head over to a jail and demand that they be released. Modernize the same playbook that we used to bring down the Soviet Union. We could do it easier and cheaper than we did then. And there's plenty that activists like those in this room can do. I mentioned before that 30 states have implemented divestment measures related to Iran. We should get every single state to implement every single kind of divestment measure possible. And based on the past success, even in liberal places like California, that conservatives would argue would be the toughest nut to crack, it passed relatively easily. This is a fight that you can win. I like fights that you can easily win. Then you have no excuse for not taking it on. So we should get every single state to do that. And yes, the deal does require the president to use, quote, all available authorities to stop us and force this treaty that's not a treaty on the state and local governments. But he'll lose. That's not one that he can win. That requires him taking on Democratic governors across the country. It won't work. Well, unfortunately, to date, not a single governor, including those running for president, have talked about doing this. On the individual level, Americans can invest in terror-free mutual funds. We can tell companies that if they want to do business with the Iranian regime and get blood money, we're going to make sure that you lose money. That's not a profitable investment for you. If America forces international businesses to choose us over Iran, and we could do this also with a sanctions bill, we could put the regime in an even worse position than they were before this deal was signed. Because everyone will choose us. We should also call for the arming of Christians in Iraq. The Christians have finally begun forming self-defense forces, not militias, not sectarian forces, and not terrorist groups, but self-defense forces. The U.S. has provided support to the Kurds, to the Sunni tribes, to Shiites, including some linked to Iran, but never to the Christians, the one demographic group in Iraq that has never victimized anybody. If there's anyone deserving of our support, it's the Christians. And again, not a single presidential candidate has called for arming the Christians in Iraq, on either side. Oh, they'll support arming Sunni tribes and Shiites and Kurds. No one has called for arming the Christians so that they can protect themselves from genocide. And that's also going to be a topic of our next documentary coming out next year. So I encourage everyone, ask every presidential candidate, why is it that almost every demographic group in Iraq is worthy of our support and worthy of survival except for the Christians? We need to stop our policy of discriminating against the Christians in Iraq. And with that, I'll just close now for the video, and then I have some additional comments I'll make, and then we can go to Q&A. But thanks everyone for tuning in. And just a few closing thoughts for you guys, because I always hear that when people leave my sessions, they usually are depressed. And people ask me how I'm not in a mental institution and why I'm happy and optimistic. My optimism isn't a psychological trick, right? I don't see a counselor in order to do this. It's because when you are absorbed in this, I can see the brighter future ahead. That's due to my analysis, my objective analysis. And so I want to talk about that very briefly. Understand that we're not just talking about blunting an inevitable slide into a darker future. We're talking about taking the opportunities that are at hand so that we can create a brighter future. It's something that can be done, and I would argue can be done easily. Islamist extremism isn't going to be defeated in a single moment. It's not a traditional war. And so you can understand why people are pessimistic when progress is so incremental and doesn't get noticed. But there's plenty for our adversaries to worry about. I would say more than for us to worry about. For example, Honor Diaries, our latest documentary, which is right there. A lot of people said, you're not going to reach different elements of the American population about that, including the more left-wing anti-war crowd. You're not going to reach the Muslim world. Let me tell you, we've screened Honor Diaries, which is a film about the struggle for women's rights in the Muslim world, on over 200 college campuses, usually hosted by women's rights groups. It's been shown by groups like the National Organization of Women, chapters of them, and introducing this topic to them. And we struck a chord in the Muslim world. Our Arabic Facebook page for that film, where we give updates on women's rights in the Arab world, has over 500,000 likes. It's not even in English. That's entirely coming from Arab speakers. And we've had screenings in Egypt, Tunisia, Iraq, and Pakistan. In Tunisia, which the Muslim Brotherhood originally was elected to power in, their branch there anyway, the most secular democratic candidate who advocated separation of mosque and state won the last election. In Egypt, Muslims and Christians came together to overthrow the Muslim Brotherhood after it was elected into power. We've seen a backlash against the Islamists in Libya, in Bangladesh, even Turkey. Ronald Reagan once said that freedom and democracy will leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history. And I tell you with the utmost confidence, that is within our capability to also leave the Iranian regime and its Islamic revolution on the ash heap of history. And so our job today, in closing, is not to be so naive, not so pessimistic, not so weak, and not so selfish that we force the next generation to solve a problem that we should have. If we're willing to seize these opportunities I outlined, and there's many more, then victory really is ours. So don't talk about this as if this is an inevitable conflict that will never end. This is something that we can end and end on our terms. Thank you.